My name is Peter Bowman. I'm the president of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. And I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to both our in-person audience and our online audience for our 2022 Spring Forum fundraiser. We will more formally introduce our program participants shortly, but I want to take a moment to tell you how thrilled and excited we are to have Lieutenant General Douglas Lute, U.S. Army retired, former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, and Deputy National Security Advisor, plus Victoria Holt, Director of the John Sloan Dickey Center at Dartmouth, the Center for International Understanding. And so to have them with us tonight is wonderful. The subject they're talking about tonight is NATO, an alliance for the 21st century. I cannot think of two more qualified, let's call them diplomatic practitioners, and I cannot think of a more timely topic than NATO. So I am really looking forward to the discussion later on this evening. I have a few, how shall I say, public announcements to make beforehand, however. For those unfamiliar with the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, we are a non-for-profit organization supported financially by memberships, program fees, grants, donations, and sponsorships from both individuals and businesses. We welcome not yet members and strongly encourage you to join us. We take no positions on policy, politics, parties, or candidates. In other words, we are, to use the overworked term, nonpartisan. We have fostered learning, discussion, and involvement in world affairs within the state of New Hampshire for almost 70 years. Now, some of us are beyond that in age, but it's a long time no matter how you look at it. We help create and sustain international connections that enhance our state's cultural, economic, and civic life. We help build global knowledge and understanding through educational programs for communities and schools on the subject of foreign policy. We help develop international leaders in partnership with the U.S. Department of State. And finally, we strongly believe that an informed public is one of the bedrock principles of a functioning democracy. Next, I'd like to extend a heartfelt thank you to our partners. First and foremost is Southern New Hampshire University, colloquially called SNU. They are our mission partner, and without them, we'd be kind of homeless on the side of the road there. Also, our title sponsor is CCA Global Partners, which works with small family-owned businesses worldwide to make them succeed. And then finally, our supporting sponsor is the full-service law firm of McLean Middleton, which has offices in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. And in a sense, you, our members and donors, are also our partners. If you're not already a member, as I mentioned previously, we want you to consider joining us on our journey. Talk to our staff, any of the board members in the audience, or go to wacnh.org to see how you can be part of the journey with us. I'd like to now turn over the podium to the Council's Executive Director, who has our corporate history. He makes us work. I can't say enough good things about Tim Horgan, who will present our annual Global Leadership Award. Thank you.
All right, before I do that, I must model our wonderful new masks. So they are out front for anyone who would like to take one and help spread the good word about the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. So, beautiful look, get your pictures, all that fun stuff. All right. Done with that now. coming tonight. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate the support that you show to our organization. Special thank you to Ambassador Lute and Dr. Holt for joining us. We were so happy that they were both able to actually fly up together on the same flight out of Washington, D.C., which is great to see the global connections and the international connections that the state has growing here. So, in terms of that, every year, for the past couple of years, we maybe have taken a COVID break, but we're excited to bring back the Global Leadership Award this year for a very deserving awardee. It is an award that we look to give out to a person, an organization, a group of people who have done great work to connect New Hampshire to the world, to help solve problems around the world, and help show that New Hampshire does have strong international connections that maybe a lot of people don't think about every day of their lives. So the person, the awardee, who many of you probably have already seen in the various postings we've done about this, is Dave Tilley, the Director of Veteran Services at Harbor Care, former HUD Regional Director. I met Dave, I don't know, probably 10 years ago when he was working for Frank Ginta. I used to run our international visitor exchange programs, and Dave was always very excited to meet with our visitors, to talk with them about government, to talk about how how the federal works in the local level, and our visitors always really enjoyed meeting with him. I also did some work with Dave on his program called Young Rescuers USA, which is a first responder competition for high school students around the world. He took a number of teams over to Belarus, correct? And Ukraine?
9 years to Belarus.
9 years in Belarus to not only compete in this competition and build relationships, but also to meet with other students from around the world, other young people from around the world, share experiences, and build connections, which is what the World Affairs Council is really about, is building those connections. More recently, Dave has been a wonderful home hospitality host and homestay host for many of our international visitors, bringing people from all over the world to his beautiful home in Henniker, and previously in Concord, to just experience what everyday life is like in New Hampshire. It's a wonderful program and a great opportunity to make some really good, strong friendships. One of the, I think, if I can speak for you, Dave, one of the coolest ones you've had was the Ukrainians we had last year. It was our one in-person exchange program last year, and we had 3 members of parliament who Dave is still in constant contact with. The latest reports are that they're still safe. 2 of them are in Kyiv, and 1 is in Lviv. And so continues to get updates from them. I think our protester buddies out there may be interested to hear some of the stories that these people are actually experiencing, but you never know. Hey, we made it, we're being protested. Well, we can put the blame on whomever we want at the moment. But also, many of you may have seen a lot of posts and a lot of news stories about the former president of Poland being here in New Hampshire. A lot of work being done to raise funds for the people of Ukraine, for the people of Poland, to support the people of Ukraine. You're gonna have to update my numbers. The last I heard, it was over $1 million in supplies and cash. What's the latest update there?
We're around, there is Fred here.
Is Fred here?
Fred would know, they sent the new numbers, but...
Yeah, so over $1 million and continuing to grow. He had a very, very busy last 10 or so days, driving Lech all around the Northeast. He actually dumped Lech today to come to this event and receive his award. So you know how prestigious this award must be if the former president of Poland is left to his own devices. But that reminds me, I actually am going to have to run and grab something off my computer real quick. Sorry. Crazy day.
Well, how about those Red Sox? Okay, how about those Celtics? We just had the president throw out the opening pitch to the Red Sox last night.
So anyone who watched the game last night may have seen President Walesa throw out the first pitch. He, as was reported to me, did make it over the plate. The first time he's thrown a baseball ever. To a national broadcast. But most importantly, I think, and really shows the unique connections that these exchanges can have. When they were driving back from Connecticut, doing an event at our sister council, the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, they blew a tire. And the state trooper who pulled over to help them out was from Poland himself originally. And so they got to have a wonderful time making international news for a flat tire. Maybe a little more than that. But what I did need to get off my computer, and I didn't want to forget about, thank you, Anne, for coordinating this. I'm not sure if Dave knows this is happening or not, but we actually have a letter from President Walesa. Thank you, Dave, for all that he did. So I want to read that out for all to hear, both here in person, online, and for the recording. So this will be out there forever, Dave. It better be a good letter. All right, let's see. Dear Mr. David Tilley, thank you for preparing and coordinating my visit to the USA. Thanks to this, I had the opportunity to exchange views on the current situation in the world with many people, promote Poland, and build relations between our nations. We touched upon many important topics, such as the war in Ukraine, the problems of Ukrainian refugees in Poland, and the possibilities that the USA has to help overcome this crisis. I believe that together we can build a better, safer world, and such meetings are very much needed. Congratulations on bringing you the prize, and I hope we will meet again. Lech Walesa. I don't think I have anything more to say after that, so Dave, if you want to come on up.
Wow. When I got the call, I'm just so deeply honored and humbled. As many of you know, I so passionately believe in the mission of the World Affairs Council and the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, especially when hosting our guests and those connections and those relationships and that understanding that we build together. I just deeply appreciate that and think that is so important. I'll touch upon a couple of the things that Tim had mentioned. I mean, President Walesa had the honor to meet at Harvard University a number of years ago with Anne through a mutual friend, Fredo Arias King, and we're all very deeply passionate about human rights and democracy. And from that, it developed a wonderful relationship and friendship with the former president. And I had originally invited him to New England to receive an honorary degree, and then COVID happened, and that impacted the president himself on his health. And we got to revisit the trip when he was coming this year to Texas and said, would you come, Mr. President? And it was, yes, but we got 10 days to film. So 10 days of developing a schedule for the president. He hasn't slowed down in his spirit one bit about his passion for improving the world, about making the world a better place, and also right now helping with the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine with the refugee situation in Poland. So when I originally invited him, I had no idea how much it would tie directly into the work that we were doing in Ukraine. And this past year was honored, as mentioned, to host Ukraine members of Parliament, Pavlo, who stayed right at my home, and other folks at home hosted. And I've been over there a number of times, twice since the annexation of Crimea. And, you know, on that I'm trying to figure out how we can help. With President Walesa, I was with him this morning. I discussed with him that I was going to bring him to the airport, but you know, I was getting this great international award, which he could appreciate because it's very similar to ones that he's earned, like the Nobel Peace Prize. He has a wonderful sense of humor. And was at, you know, with the World Affairs Council, also in Connecticut too, but also with regard to Ukraine, when I saw the situation over there and the people, dove in on that. A friend, Fred Coker, who was going to be here today, has a TV show, and he knew that Sean O'Kane, who was former commissioner of DRED, did trade missions there, and Sean's Democrat and Republican, and we knew each other a little bit, but now we're brothers of different mothers. We just dove in on this wanting to help, and ended up in about 2 weeks raising, as mentioned, now I think it's over $1 million to help with Ukraine aid, and just how many people just pitched in, volunteering, the Common Man Restaurant giving sites, Catholic Medical Center in the state of New Hampshire. I mean, we had 64 pallets of aid that we were able to ship over, and Sean O'Kane, who wished he could be here, I mean, he was the glue keeping us together because I have a day job. And just amazing. And then, as folks might have read, Alex Ray just made his own challenge of $1 million to help. And our members of Parliament and our friends over there, Roman, we've been in touch with like daily on what can help. Granting United Way, we needed a nonprofit to go through. They did zero overhead, direct funds going there. So, and we knew right where it's going, and Walesa Foundation was helping us through Poland, and just amazing, and on how it all ended up, you know, tying together and helping. And Roman had asked for, can we get, we need in Kiev 1,000 combat life-saving kits, and I was looking at the price, and I'm like, well, let's put a goal that we'll get that in there, because that's a lot. I was thinking maybe 100 or something there, $200-300. We were able to get a good value, and I found out today we're going to be able to send them 3,000.
Wow.
So, but they're all through relationships that we build person to person, and everyone can make a difference. And President Walesa showed that through his entire life. And Belarus was mentioned too. This morning, I realized 9 years of doing work in Belarus, I became friends with many of their members of government, and one of their members, is at a very, very high level, appointed directly by President Lukashenko, and he was saying his praise, and please thank President Walesa is a hero, and we want peace and goodness and the right results. And so even at the highest levels in that end, by keeping those lines of communication and friendship, you know, we can make a difference. But thank you so much.
So you don't break it. All right. Thank you again, Dave, for all the great work that you and your partners have done to make this happen. It's really been quite impressive to see this. And most importantly, thank you so much for hosting our visitors, because it's sometimes difficult, as Anise, our program director for exchanges, can tell you. So if any of you want to host visitors, Anise, the person to talk to. We have a number of home hosts around. Ginny and Joseph Minowski, Davis and Zuki have hosted, Dave and Misty Schroeder as well. I think Peter and Helen maybe hosted a couple. And Diane and Mitch. A few other people, I'm sure. Jim and, Mary Jane and John have also hosted. So thank you so much for all the support. We really appreciate it. We now have a video from Senator Shaheen introducing the event, and she has a few words she'd like to share. So Alan, whenever you are ready.
Hello, and thank you so much for inviting me to share a few words with you today for this important event sponsored by the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, NATO, an alliance for the 21st century. The role of NATO has never been as critical as it is today, given Vladimir Putin's unprovoked, barbaric war in Ukraine. The world Hello, and thank you so much for inviting me to share a few words with you today for this important event sponsored by the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, NATO, an alliance for the 21st century. The role of NATO has never been as critical as it is today, given Vladimir Putin's unprovoked, barbaric war in Ukraine. The world is bearing witness to the gravest national security threat to Europe since World War II. We cannot look away, and there must be accountability for the horrific violence targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. That's where NATO and the global community can and must play a role. While Putin had hoped to undermine NATO and separate the U.S. from our European allies, his war in Ukraine has done just the opposite. NATO is reinvigorated, and the transatlantic alliance is more unified than ever. During the previous administration, when support for NATO was in doubt, Senator Tillis, Republican from North Carolina, and I reestablished the Senate NATO Observer Group to ensure a strong bipartisan commitment in Congress for the alliance. And the Senate is ready to act quickly should Finland and Sweden decide to join NATO in ratifying the North Atlantic Treaty and ensuring that Article 5 will extend to our Nordic allies just as soon as possible. You have a great panel today for this important discussion. Welcome to special guest Lieutenant General Douglas Lute, former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, and Victoria Holt, Director of Dartmouth's Center for International Understanding. Thank you both for playing a role in sharing the message of how critical the transatlantic alliance is not only to our world, but also to U.S. national security. I hope you have an engaging and productive dialogue. Thank you. Hello, and thank you so much for inviting me to share a few words with you today for this important event sponsored by the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire.
Especially her support of the International Visitor Exchange Program, which is a big part of the organization's work here in New Hampshire. So I am done talking because you've heard enough from me, but I'd like to bring up Dr. Melinda Negron-Gonzalez to introduce our speakers for tonight. Melinda.
Well, thank you. Good evening. I have the great honor of introducing our esteemed speaker and moderator. Dr. Victoria Holt is the Norman E. McCullough Jr., Director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding. She joined Dartmouth in September 2021 with a background in public policy, leadership, and diplomacy. In Washington, D.C., she served as Vice President of the Henry L. Stinson Center, a research and policy institute focused on international affairs, and directed the Transforming Conflict and Governance program. Earlier, Holt was tapped to be Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Security, Bureau of International Organization Affairs, and served at the State Department from 2009 to early 2017. In that role, she was responsible for policy and guidance for actions in the UN Security Council and oversaw the Offices of Peace Operations, Sanctions and Counterterrorism, and UN Political Affairs. Holt led the development of U.S. diplomatic initiatives, including the 2015 Leaders Summit on the UN Peacekeeping, hosted by President Obama to increase capacities for UN operations. Welcome to Victoria Holt. And our esteemed speaker this evening is Lieutenant General Douglas Lute. He is the International and Defense Chair of the BGR Group, CEO of Cambridge Global Advisors, LLC, and McDermott Distinguished Chair of Social Sciences at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Ambassador Lute is the former United States Ambassador to NATO. Appointed by President Obama, he assumed the Brussels-based post in 2013 and served until 2017. During this period, he was instrumental in designing and implementing the alliance responses to the most severe security challenges in Europe since the end of the Cold War. A career Army officer, in 2010, Lute retired from active duty as a lieutenant general after 35 years of service. In 2007, President Bush named him as assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor to coordinate the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. In 2009, he was the senior White House official retained by President Obama, and his focus on the National Security Council staff shifted to South Asia. Across these two administrations, he served a total of 6 years in the White House. Before being assigned to the White House, General Lute served as Director of Operations on the Joint Staff, overseeing U.S. military operations worldwide. From 2004 to 2006, he was Director of Operations for the United States Central Command, with responsibility for U.S. military operations in 25 countries across the Middle East, Eastern Africa, and Central Asia, in which over 200,000 U.S. troops operated. Through his military diplomatic career, he received numerous honors and awards, including 3 awards of the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, including the State Department's Distinguished Honor Award, the Grand Officer of the Order of Merit for the Italian Republic, and finally the Commander's Cross of the Order of Merit for the Federal Republic of Germany. That's a mouthful. General Lute holds degrees from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University and the United States Military Academy at West Point, which named him a distinguished graduate in 2018. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a charter member of the Senior Military Advisory Group of the United States Institute of Peace, and a member of the American Academy of Diplomacy, as well as a member of the board of the Atlantic Council of the United States. Finally, it's my great honor to ask you to come up to the stage, Victoria Holt and Ambassador Lute.
My mother would be so proud.
Well, thank you so much for welcoming us both here today. We did indeed fly on a plane from Washington, D.C. And before I begin my job as moderator, I'll just say I came from an international security conference. And we had national security advisors speak to us. We talked about what's going on in Ukraine, what's happening with China, the future of nuclear weapons. But the panel that might have been most important was what do the American people think? So I want to thank you for hosting this, but also for what you do all the time here in New Hampshire with the World Affairs Council. Because at the end of the day, this is about the American people, this is about communities, and how international affairs genuinely touch our lives. And translating that is an ongoing task. And those who live in Washington often are the most out of touch with what goes on. Just to kick us off. So we're talking today a great deal about NATO and Ukraine, which I will note comes after, in great part, your military career. When you had become a diplomat, you had left, I think, over 35 years of military service and joined NATO. So let me ask you just a very first simple question. What was it that, fantastic, that drew you to the military in the first place?
So eventually we'll get to Ukraine, right?
We will get to Ukraine quite swiftly.
And undoubtedly we'll talk about Sweden and Finland, but before we get there, right, I want to ask the executive director, the other members of the board of the council, how did you coordinate the membership applications of Sweden and Finland on the day, of this World Affairs Council? So if we can figure that out, we should come to the council for other big issues, because this has got to be more than just a mere coincidence that we're here on what is for the Alliance, a historic day, right? So,
well, I will say we were fortunate to have one of Dr. Holt's wonderful professors, Dr. Wolfforth, speak on the day of the invasion. He had half an hour left in his schedule when I reached out to him. So being able to do things virtually has been a boon to our ability to plan ahead and find out when the bad things are going to happen. So we're working on things in this case, perhaps.
so I guess you can either watch world events very closely or just join the council. So how did I get involved in all this? So I grew up in northern Indiana on Lake Michigan in the shadows of the city of Chicago. And that's a very industrialized part of the country. Gary, Indiana is the next biggest city. And I decided upon graduating from high school that I didn't want to go work in the steel mills. And I imagined that there was something else out there beyond northern Indiana. Aside from the fact that we're very close to Michigan, and Michigan was a bit of an excursion for me as a young high school student, mostly because you could get beer at 18 years in Michigan, and it was 21 in Indiana. So. But I applied to West Point, and I was accepted, and that really began this, 4 decades of jaunting around the world and doing very interesting things with the U.S. government. And I sort of never looked back. So if you have young students or nieces, nephews, maybe even grandkids, right? I think the message is there's a lot of world out there, and you don't have to be confined to, to Manchester or Michigan City.
Yeah. And also I think that you're pointing to something about how the civilian and the military communities can interact in places maybe like Washington, but in the rest of the country, not everybody knows their opportunities are available to you. Just as a note, I went to the Naval War College, not to get in the way of the Army, because I was a young staff.
It's a reputable It's not for everyone, okay, but it's okay.
But back to you. So you were serving in NATO when Russia first went in and took Crimea. Can you tell us a bit about that moment and how that felt? Was that considered a strategic move? Was that sort of anticipated? I think it lays a little bit of the history for us, and it will come up to the present moment. Just curious how you saw that.
Well, so the big change for me near the end of my federal government career was moving from the White House to NATO. And I decided that 6 years was long enough in the White House, working on the 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Basically, we weren't getting very far very fast, as you might have read. And I needed to get on with whatever was going to be the next chapter in my life. Right? I imagined leaving government. So then this opportunity came up to go to NATO. I thought, gosh, that could be pretty interesting. And what could possibly go wrong? So as I read into it and began the confirmation process, become ambassador of NATO, turns out there's a wonderful residence, a big house there. My family really enjoyed this. It'd be a break from 6 years in the White House. And so let's go do NATO. And, career-wise, it sort of completed the life cycle for me. Because as a young Army lieutenant, in the height of the Cold War in 1976, my first assignment was on the inter-German border along the Iron Curtain, right? And that was, of course, although I didn't appreciate it as a lieutenant, that was a NATO structure. That was a NATO command, right? So I thought, at the end of my career, I'll go back to NATO and sort of complete this career life cycle, right? And as I said, it promised to be somewhat more relaxing than the 18-acre compound in the White House. And 6 months after I got there, as your question suggests, Putin invaded, seized illegally the Crimean Peninsula, which for decades, roughly 60 years, had been a piece of sovereign Ukrainian territory. So he violated territorial integrity of Ukraine. And then that wasn't enough for President Putin. He destabilized these two provinces of Ukraine, southeastern Ukraine, along the Don River, so therefore the Donbass, the Don River Basin, right, the Donbass. And he did this with Russian active duty forces, but under the guise that they were supporting Russian-speaking Ukrainian citizens who wanted to separate from parents, right? More along the lines of sort of unruly motorcycle gangs than military formations, right? But Putin sent active duty military into these two provinces and destabilized the Donbass as well. And as my bio reads, in 2014 we considered that the largest violation of the post-World War II order to date. Well, Putin's done it again, and he beat the record, okay? This time he's going in conventionally in a major way and has created this ongoing tragedy in Ukraine. It was a big shift for NATO in 2014. We began in 2014 with Crimea and the Donbass to talk about that period being a strategic inflection point, meaning a point in history that only comes around every 20, 30, 40 years, but which represents such a dramatic shift, in this case, such a dramatic violation of international norms, which go all the way back to the UN Charter, which was signed in 1945, right? Which codifies this idea of national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and that all the members of the UN sign up to these principles. And here Russia, a sitting member of not only the United Nations, but a permanent member of the Security Council, tears up the UN Charter and violates the sovereignty of another country. So 2014 was seen, at NATO anyway, as a big shift. And we took a number of what seemed at that time to be prudent and appropriate commensurate steps in response to what Putin did. 8 years later now, it's pretty clear that those steps were insufficient. They did not, they certainly bolstered alliance confidence. So they were well received internal to the alliance. But it's quite clear that they were insufficient in terms of support to Ukraine and so forth, because in fact, deterrence failed. He did it again. And when he invaded beginning February this year, it obviously was with much larger ambitions, much larger operational goals, and actually the aim was quite clearly to topple the Zelensky government and to take over Ukraine. So on the one hand, I think NATO gives itself reasonably good grades for solidifying the alliance, but because Ukraine is outside the alliance, I don't think we can be too happy with the effect we had there.
So I want to get at some point to what's actually happening in Ukraine,
Sure.
since it's so severe. But I think you raised a really good point about Russia's behavior. So let me ask you, you point out that Russia invading another country against belief in territorial integrity and sovereignty, not just the UN Charter, but as a permanent member of the Security Council, Russia has personal responsibility for every major challenge to international peace and security. And yet, they seem to have deeply miscalculated. The United States declassified immense amounts of information intelligence to announce to the world that this was coming. The Ukrainians have fought back in a way that I think many did not expect, with ferocity and with some great success. NATO has strengthened itself. China has not appeared to come in to sweep to the rescue either with more arms or with relief on the sanctions. And indeed, the sanctions that the West has organized, while not passing through approval from the United Nations, the votes that Russia's had show very few allies fully on board with what they've done. How did Russia get it wrong to think that they could do this? And then what did we get wrong in thinking that they would do this?
Right. Well, I think you're right, Victoria. I think you cite the three big miscalculations by President Putin as the commander-in-chief. First of all, he overestimated his forces. He underestimated his opponents, the Ukrainians, right? And he vastly underestimated the Western world response, right? So the response by NATO and frankly, beyond NATO. I mean, the coalition that comprises the sanctions regime against Russia as a result of his invasion of Ukraine, right, represents 60% of global GDP. That's well beyond the US and NATO alone. That's, Japan is in there, South Korea is in there, Australia is in there, and so forth. You also mentioned, however, that while the coalition that has been sparked by the invasion is 60% of global GDP, it's less than 20% of global population. So there are big parts of the world that are either agnostic or sitting on the fence with regard to enforcing sanctions on Russia. You mentioned China, obviously important. India is sort of non-aligned here, sitting on the fence. Much of the southern hemisphere has not signed up for this sanctions regime. So I think he underestimated the result he got, but it could be even more. And I think one of the things that this administration has on its to-do list is to try to broaden the sanctions regime, not because, economic sanctions coming out of Africa, for example, might be so critically important to Vladimir Putin, but because of the importance, the political importance of getting beyond this sort of minority of global population that cite this invasion as wrong and as unacceptable and as something we're not going to tolerate. So we've still got diplomatic work to do here, although I think Putin underestimated it. On the U.S. intelligence front, we have quite a history in the American intelligence community of doing pretty well estimating things that are tangible. Okay? We can count tanks. Okay? We can count aircraft. We can count ships. And so forth. And we can compile them and assign to them based on the doctrine that those forces are intended to operate under. We can sort of make assessments on how they're going to do. We do less well, historically, in assessing the intangible, the moral factors in war. Something like 200 years ago, Napoleon has this great, it's very Napoleonic, right? But he said something like, in war, the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. Okay, so let me translate. That means Napoleon believed that morale, discipline, unit cohesion, training, leadership were 3 times more important than quantifiable factors. So numbers of troops, numbers of things. And we don't estimate, we don't assess those intangible factors very well. And it's not just Ukraine. I was deeply involved with the development of the Iraqi National Security Forces, for example, right? We gave them a lot of stuff, okay? And when al-Baghdadi and ISIS assaulted in basically pickup trucks, the second largest city in Iraq, in Mosul, 4 Iraqi divisions melted and just deserted, okay? Well, we had given them the stuff, but we hadn't really adequately dealt with things like leadership and unit cohesion and so forth. The Afghan National Army, okay, dissolved in a matter of a few weeks, despite at least 15 years out of the 20 we were there, at least 15 years of concerted effort to give them fighting capability. Now, we probably don't want to, that's another World Affairs Council meeting.
We'll make sure we ask questions on Afghanistan.
But look at our estimate of the Soviet Army at the height of the Cold War, right? And when the Berlin Wall fell and the Iron Curtain came down, and we actually got to go see some of this stuff and some of these units, our assessment changed a lot, okay? Look at our assessment of the North Vietnamese Army and the South Vietnamese Army. We didn't get that assessment so right. So we have a pretty poor history here of assessing these moral factors, these intangibles, and I'm afraid that's what we did here. We assigned to the Russian army massed on the Ukrainian border before the February invasion, right? We were counting things like, remember, there's 100,000 troops there. No, it's updated. It's 140,000 Russian troops. Now it's 190,000. My God, they're going to overwhelm, right? And it turns out they're still Russian, okay, in terms of quality. On the other hand, I don't think we gave enough credit to the Ukrainians. And what's proven there is that if you attack another country, and for that country, the Ukrainians, you present them with an existential threat, they're going to fight hard. And I don't think we quite accounted for that. So we shared a lot of intelligence.
Yeah.
Not all of it was right. And I think there's a serious reassessment going on inside the intelligence communities in Washington today about how do we get better at assessing these hard to assess factors like cohesion, morale, and leadership. Because we didn't get it right.
And it sounds like corruption may have played a role as well.
Well, right. I mean, you see.
How the military would operate. But let's
So if I could just pick on that just a bit,
Yes.
right? So it turns out that the corruption that's endemic in Russian society infected the military industry as well. So there was a lot of money poured into the last 15 years or so into the Russian military, but we're seeing where some of that investment didn't have a great effect on the battlefield because there was skimming and there was low-cost purchasing with the, with the overhead going elsewhere and so forth. So this corrosive effect of corruption, which they could not separate, turns out you could not create a firewall between the corruption in Russian society and government and the Russian military. So it infected the Russian military.
So the phone rang and they asked you to come back to NATO. And they asked you to do a few things. They said, okay, we've got a reasonable analysis of where we are today, but we're looking at almost 13 million people being displaced from Ukraine, either internally or externally. It's about half and half. That's on top of about 80 million people worldwide displaced from existing conflicts, you've named a few. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, wars across. So this is a worldwide displacement crisis. We're soon to face a world food shortage because Ukraine and Russia are considered the breadbaskets of the region. And that is, I think, causing a food summit in New York this week to particularly reach out to countries in the Middle East. Some of the ones you mentioned may not be voting with the West, but not also voting with Russia, who are face chronic shortages in Africa. And we're also seeing Russia employ a class of weapons, cluster munitions. They've been putting landmines out. And they've been using violence against civilians at a level that I think at least most publics are not used to seeing. So what would you say to NATO? Like, NATO is not getting involved because it's not a NATO country. But if you go to NATO's website, there's a long list of all the things, trainings and partnerships. So the relationships maybe doesn't have the NATO flag, but all the countries of Europe have been working with Ukraine. How would you prepare to deal with those both strategic challenges as well as day-to-day life in Ukraine for the people that are in the war today?
Well, look, NATO is involved. I mean, NATO may not have NATO troops with the NATO flag on their shoulder, as we did for more than 10 years in Afghanistan. NATO ran the war in Afghanistan for more than 10 years, almost 15. That's not the way we're involved in Ukraine. But NATO's very much involved. I mean, all the supplies of the Ukrainian military are flowing through NATO troops, or NATO countries, right? So the 4 NATO countries that have land borders with Ukraine, so Poland most prominently with President Zelensky's home country, but also Slovakia, Romania, and I'm missing one, Hungary. So there's all the American armaments that are getting to Ukraine are going through NATO countries. Some NATO countries have done some very prominent made some prominent contributions. So the Germans, the Czechs and the Slovaks have sent main battle tanks, which we haven't done. But they sent main battle tanks directly to Ukraine, right? The Slovaks have given them their national air defense system, the S-300, which happens to be a Soviet vintage air defense system. They've put them on trailers and moved them into Ukraine. So NATO's doing a lot. NATO's also doing a lot in partnership with the EU to deal with the refugee flow, right? So NATO doesn't have a first sort of responder responsibility for refugees, but NATO aircraft are moving refugee assistance support into Poland and other countries. And NATO has the ability to organize logistics. And this is, when you're dealing with 4 or 6 million refugees, most of whom have flooded into Poland and are not living in refugee camps. They're living on the Polish economy. They're living in apartments, they're living in Airbnbs, they're living sponsored by Polish citizens, and they're making their way from Poland into Western Europe as well. You go into Berlin today, for example, there are many Ukrainian refugees who have sought just housing on the generosity of the citizens of Berlin. So NATO's got a big role to play here. And I sort of refute this idea that, well, because we don't have NATO troops in Ukraine, we're not doing enough. There's a reason we don't have NATO troops in Ukraine. And that's because Ukraine is not a member of the alliance. But if you go back before the alliance to the UN Charter, Article 51, bear with me, Article 50, I'm a diplomat. Sort of, late in life. I'm a late in life diplomat. Article 51 of the UN Charter says that any country which is invaded has a right to defense. And the other members of the United Nations have a responsibility to support that defense. So even if there were no NATO, the United States should be doing what it's doing today under the UN Charter. So I think there's deep and broad commitment to military support, to economic sanctions against Russia, and where I think we need work is to convince countries, like the ones which are going to be affected by the food crisis, right? To convince those countries that such a violation of the international order, of a big country invading another country without cause, on phony pretexts, that is simply intolerable, because the impacts are not going to stay in Ukraine. The impact, we're seeing the impacts on gas prices. If you go to the nearest gas station to this site, there's an impact on the war in Ukraine. If you go to Egypt and try to buy flour for bread, there's an impact on the war, from the war in Ukraine. These things don't stay localized. We're too interconnected. And there's going to be more of that. So I would like more work on that 20%, to supplement that 20% of the world population who understand what a grave violation of international norms this is. And if anyone thinks they can simply sit this one out and not be affected by this, they're simply wrong.
I think that's a great point, and it might be time to start looking for hands in the audience. And while I'm giving you all a moment to think of a question, I'll just say that many have declared that the international rules-based order was done with Russia's invasion. But I think you've made a compelling case, and instead, it may have strengthened it. I'll note that after Russia invaded, countries like Kenya and Mexico gave speeches saying, we have been colonized, and we didn't like it. And that's what Russia's doing now to Ukraine. So they may not always agree with the United States or the Western Alliance, but in
its most fundamental sense, this is a binary choice between a world that's dominated by empires, so big countries that can invade other countries, take them under their wing, dominate their politics, take the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, right? Empires, versus a world order that is organized around nation states, where individual sovereign states have rights. And this is a struggle between an attempt by President Putin to reestablish at least elements of the Russian Empire and get away with it, right? And so every nation state in the world should be saying, I'm not signing up for that, because eventually that could affect me.
Okay, we do have an in-person question, so we'll start there. See the microphone so our online audience can hear.
My concern is that as time drags on, maybe a little bit more in Putin's favor as far as cohesiveness of NATO. For example, we see the gas prices you just talked about, or the food scarcity that might show up in the world. And even today, we're hearing about Erdogan's not happy that Sweden and Finland may be joining NATO. Orban is concerned about perhaps the embargo on Russian energy products.
Right.
So as more time goes on and the war drags on and people start to lose a little bit of their focus on it, I'm concerned that the cohesiveness of NATO may wane a little bit. And I was wondering what, as a diplomat, and how you feel about that.
Look, you're onto something. This is the hard work that lays ahead for us, right? In relative terms, we've figured out how to do what has proven to be the more simple part, which is provide them weaponry, right? So we've, I think, done an admirable job of equipping and training the Ukrainians so they can defend themselves. And I give the administration and NATO quite high marks in that regard. But there are potential fissures in this cohesion that lay ahead. And you mentioned a couple of them. Let me just run through this. I mean, if anyone's ever visited Turkey and had the opportunity to go to a Turkish souk or bazaar, a marketplace, right? You don't just go in there and buy something at the set price, right? There's a big bargaining that takes it. That's a little bit what we're seeing on the international scene. We're buying a carpet here, okay? And Erdogan, I believe, oh, by the way, this all hinges on the fact that in order for Finland and Sweden to join, the vote inside the current members of the alliance has to be 30-0. It's complete consensus. And it's in the Washington Treaty, right? It's in the NATO Treaty. So current members have to vote unanimously. So what Erdogan is saying is, okay, I'm anticipating this vote is coming up. He's paying attention, right? Good for him, right? Maybe I can get something from this as the vote nears. And that's the bargaining space he's dealing with. And in particular, what he's dealing with is a domestic political incentive to be strong against Kurdish separatists, the PKK, the Kurdistan, or the Kurdish Workers' Party, which Turkey has declared a terrorist organization. So has the EU. So has the United States. And the PKK raises funds in both Sweden and Finland. They're tolerated in Sweden and Finland. So that's the issue for Erdogan. He could not simply sign up for membership of Sweden and Finland without making this a case, because the PKK has killed Turkish citizens over the years, right? So there's a lot behind this. At the end of the day, however, I do not believe that Turkey will veto membership here. I mean, it's also important to remember that, on the other hand, the Turks have provided the Ukrainians the most deadly weapon system the Ukrainians are using today. It's a drone, right? It's an armed drone. And the Turks have not only provided it before the invasion, they continue to provide it. The Turks have closed the access between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, prohibiting any Russian warships from reinforcing their Black Sea fleet. And that's because this is a 100-year-old Montreux Convention, which gives Turkey responsibility for access to the Black Sea. So they've imposed it, and they've imposed it on the Russian Navy. So Turkey's doing as Turkey usually does, which is look for opportunities to advance its own interests and so forth. Now, the big issue, and the big one that all of us should watch carefully, is this energy question, right? Because it is true that Russia is a major supplier of oil and gas, and to a lesser extent coal, right? So it's a major energy exporter. That is a global market which is already at near record highs and is already very tight. So when you have a major disruption in supply, which we're going to have, right? It's going to have global impacts, and we're going to see it on our gas prices, and it will present opportunities for political problems in Europe as well. The bellwether here will be Germany. Okay, so yes, Hungary, Orban's Hungary imports something like half of its energy supplies from Russia, but those are relatively small amounts, right? Germany is the engine, the economic engine of Europe, and as goes Germany, so goes Europe. So what I'm watching there is not oil and gas, but Germany's political decision about nuclear power. Germany had taken some years ago, based on a demand from the Greens Party, which now is a member of the ruling coalition in Germany. So the Greens have got a voice they haven't always had, right? They took a decision, a national decision, to close down the last of their nuclear power plants and essentially become more reliant on renewables and Russian gas, right? Those power plants have not yet been closed. So the thing to watch here is, do they reverse that decision, at least in the midterm, and produce more electricity for themselves, by the way, clean electricity, by way of nuclear, and allow them to meet the EU targets for zeroing out Russian supplies. So this gets complicated, but it makes the point we talked about earlier. This is all interconnected. You can't imagine that what goes on in Germany or what goes on in Ukraine and Russia is going to stay there. It has an impact globally, and we are only beginning to see. We're in the first 2 months of it. We're only beginning to see the ripple effects that are going to affect all of us.
Other people wanting to ask a question. The gentleman right here, and then we'll go over here.
So my question is about the long game. We, the West, did not do the greatest job of responding to 9/11. Did not do the greatest job responding to the collapse of the Soviet Union. What do you see, how should we approach this? Do we isolate Russia more and more, driving it towards China? Or do we try to reverse this approach in the long game and make it more part of the European community?
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned what I refer to as the last two strategic inflection points. So I think 89, fall of the Berlin Wall, 91, breakup of the Soviet Union this is one of those historic chapters, right? End of one chapter, beginning of a new chapter, strategic inflection point. I think 9/11, at least certainly for us, and much of the rest of the world, was a strategic inflection point. And after 9/11, you had, for us, the 20 years of Iraq, Afghanistan, what I refer to as the Bin Laden decades, right? And I think we're at another inflection point now. And I share with you this estimate that, we don't take the long view very well in American strategy. And this is because, but of course, that's how we're structured. I mean, we have 4-year presidential administrations, right? And even with a 4-year presidential administration, our politics get sort of antsy. Because here we are about to have midterm elections, right? And what's the convention in American midterm elections? They flip. Oh, what's that all about? That's not very patient. You're not even giving one administration a full 4 years before you begin to complicate the Washington politics, right? And then you look at things like our budget cycles and so forth. We have we're organized to take a sort of business-like but very short-term tactical take on events which defy tactics. In the longer term, we cannot defy the fact that Russia will remain NATO's and Europe's largest, most militarily capable partner, if only in nuclear power terms, nuclear weapons terms, right? So Russia's not going to fundamentally change. However, getting to that longer term, I think will cause us to have to pass through Vladimir Putin. I do not see, given what he's done here, not only the invasion, but the atrocity, and the quite deliberate atrocities. I mean, there should be no mistaking. This isn't, an occasional civilian casualty or anything as tragic as that is, right? This is deliberate shelling of apartment buildings, murder, rape, and so forth, right? I don't see how Russia, ruled by Putin, returns to the community of relations. I just don't see it. So I think in the longer term, we should be thinking about what happens after Putin, whenever that is. I mean, that could be 10 years, it could be 10 months. We just don't know. I'm convinced that it will have to be organically Russian when that change is made. If we have a bad track record of estimating, foreign militaries, we have a worse track record of designing regime change, right? So I was very happy to see the administration just very explicitly and early take that off the table. We cannot imagine that we have the brilliance here to change things in Russia. That's got to be up to the Russian people. But when it happens, and it will eventually happen, someone will succeed Vladimir Putin, they're still going to have 6,000 nuclear weapons, right? So whatever comes of the next phase, right, is very much in our national interest to, as much as possible, not shape it, because I don't think we can, but leave the door open to dialogue. Because eventually, we cannot deny the facts that Russia is the geography that it is the people that it is, and they have 6,000 nuclear weapons. So this whole notion of, well, we'll just isolate them, just rings as artificial to me. We've got to take a longer view.
Thanks.
But by the way, if I may, while the U.S. government may not be perfectly structured to do that, institutions like this, institutions like academia, and so forth, and frankly, our intelligence community is quite good at taking a longer perspective. So there's plenty of room for investment in those institutions.
Thank you. You just gave us some homework. Okay, over here is the corner, and then we'll come back.
I didn't want you to leave empty-handed. Now, you should introduce yourself, sir. You're a professor at Naval War College. And I met him during the reception. I said, you may not ask a question, okay?
Yeah, I teach, Richard Loban, I teach at the Naval War College, strategic security, particularly for Africa and the Middle East. So one comment relative to the whole drift of our conversation about strategic security. Of course, we can potentially get weakened and diverted with some other crisis, but it's pretty much standard thinking within the security domain that if the dominant or intrusive invading power doesn't win, they finally lose. And if the defending power, the Ukrainians, don't lose, they finally win. So there's another flip side to the whole question of who's getting tired faster. But my real question to you from the military, from the diplomacy, is it seems to me that Putin is fighting some phase of World War II. Using mass all over Berlin, whereas the Ukrainians are fighting a very flexible, imaginative, and drone-rich war. So the question very explicitly, do you think that drones have been the switchblades or javelins or in-laws or Neptunes or all the other drones? We have a whole department of drones at the War College.
Yeah.
It seems to me it's pretty important.
I'm going to add a two-finger on that. So you're talking about the type of war. Some have begun to argue that if Putin gets desperate and he sees he can't win by the tactics he's chosen, that he could escalate. Right. And there's some concern that expansion of NATO, particularly in academic circles, has gotten him to the state of mind that he's in already. So maybe we can just add to your question, what do you think the escalation potentials are as well?
Well, so I do think Ukraine is a bit of a laboratory, a warfare laboratory. And the Ukrainian, and while in this laboratory, the Russians are employing tactics and techniques that, World War II veterans recognize. So, massed artillery, not very disciplined forces, and indiscriminate targeting of civilians and so forth. This is all very familiar to Ukraine, by the way, because Ukraine was, Ukraine fought this multiple times in the 1940s, right? So it's a laboratory there. On the Ukrainian side, I think what they have brought to this laboratory is advanced technology. So I think the use of drones. These are very tactical drones, though. I mean, drones are not new to warfare. Drones, we use drones a lot in Iraq and Afghanistan, all the way down to little handheld jobs to, drones that fly for 24 hours without without landing and so forth. So it's not so much the drones and the technology that's being employed, it's how they're employing the technology. And they're employing it by way of demonstrating that small teams, small cohesive teams, so take 10 or 12 Ukrainian soldiers, right, who are fighting for their homeland and who know every alleyway, every farm trail, every hilltop, like the back of their hand, right, who are then empowered by the ability to look over that hilltop and see what's coming, and empowered by systems that are so precise that every shot is a kill, right? And small teams like that are the ticket. They look very much like an army built around our special forces model, which is not large formations of battalions and brigades and divisions, like, you know, between hundreds, thousands, and tens of thousands of mass troops, like the Russians are, right? They look more like a U.S. Special Forces team, which is 10 or 12 people, operate independently, very low profile, hard to target. They move around quickly, a very low logistics payload. They don't require, they almost live off the land. And the Ukrainians are proving that that model, empowered by the kind of technology that you cite, is very powerful. I hope other countries who fear for their defense, by the way, before the Ukrainians invented this, the Finns invented this. This is the Finnish defense model. This is how the Finns defended themselves in World War II against the Russians, right? So the Finns know how to do this. And so I think we're being reminded that in the history of warfare, small, cohesive, disciplined teams fighting for their own countries are pretty tough to beat. Now, there's no question that Putin is suffering attrition at the hands of the Ukrainians. I mean, the estimates vary, and they're not worth getting into because we just don't have enough evidence. But he's probably lost more Russian soldiers in this 2 months in Ukraine than he did in 10 years in Afghanistan. And remember that the Soviet loss in Afghanistan was one factor of the fall of the Soviet Union. It wasn't even the principal factor, but it was a contributing factor, right? So he is suffering attrition. Something like a third of the forces that he initially invaded with have suffered that kind of attrition. And there may be remnants of them on the battlefield, but they're not effective fighting formations, right? In American training scenarios, when in our training scenarios, if one side of the fight loses 10% of our force, we stop the exercise. And we go to the review table. We say, okay, what happened? How did this catastrophe take place? We stop, and then we start the exercise again. That's 10%. That's a 10% threshold. Because at some point about there, your ability to replace the casualties, your ability to contend with the casualties, because remember, a good number of casualties are wounded, and that puts another burden on the fighting force. The loss of leaders and so forth. So our threshold for combat effectiveness is something like 10% losses. He's already suffered something like 25 to 30%. The estimates are difficult to corroborate. So he is not going to leave Ukraine with the same army that he invaded. Now, will he get to a point where he's so desperate that he has to try to pull a rabbit out of the hat, and that might push him, or so delusional maybe, that might push him across the nuclear threshold? Look, my wife is an expert in international security. In fact, the one family rule is I refuse to present after her because she's so good, right? So I'm not doing that. But she's not here this evening. But we have this family dinner table conversation about will Putin use nuclear weapons or not. She thinks he will. I think he won't. I believe that she'll have to speak for herself on this. I believe that the nuclear threshold is still a very clear red line, even for Vladimir Putin. He is delusional, he is not well informed, but he's not crazy, and he is not suicidal. is actually anything but suicidal. And crossing that nuclear threshold would edge him towards something that he simply could not control and could ultimately lead, by way of unintended escalation, to the complete destruction, not only Russia, by the way, but us as well. I don't think he's there. And I can't, as a military guy, I can't quite figure out what he would gain. He wouldn't gain anything militarily from this. And I think he would likely lose his own internal circle of military, intelligence, political advisors if he were to order that. So I'm on the hopeful side of this argument.
We'll go with that. We'll invite your wife next time, who is actually very well. I have a gentleman right here, and then Alan, if there's any questions from our audience, happy to call on you.
Thank you. Kind of in the long-term theme, there's a swath of American public, which I would
Yeah. We're looking for some.
that would say that the long-term American interest is in Asia.
And it's the responsibility
It's the responsibility of the Europeans to protect Europe. So if China is 4 times our size with an economy approaching ours and global ambitions to displace us as the primary determiner of things in the world, it's really up to the Europeans, who are very wealthy and who have more population than Russia by multiples, to take care of Russia. A lot of that comes down to Germany and whether the Europeans, and particularly the Germans, will stand up. The past administration, that was their goal, to tell NATO that NATO had that the NATO countries had to pay their due, and that we were no longer going to carry the bill for them. Do you have a point of view on whether Europe, faced with this catastrophic event, will change their mind for a longer term and carry the burden that has to fall to them if we're going to take care of Asia?
Yeah, so again, I think I'm in the optimistic camp here. So, and again, the bellwether here is Germany, as you mentioned. Germany's largest economy in Europe. It has been the largest underperformer in terms of defense contributions. So the history on this is that in 2014 under Obama, all the European allies signed up, and Angela Merkel was in the chair for Germany, signed up for 2% of national GDP into their defense budget, right? So this is the famous 2% pledge, right? At that time, in 2014, there were only 4 of 28 allies who made the 2% goal. We were one of them. And so obviously President Obama was making a big point about this, right? After Crimea and the Donbass in 2014, we went from 4 countries meeting the 2% pledge to 14. Okay? Why? It wasn't because of Obama. I often get asked, you worked for Obama. I've been somewhat outspoken about the last president. And who was more responsible for this increasing European defense spending? I say you got both presidents wrong. It wasn't Obama who signed the pledge, and it wasn't President Trump who yelled at people about it. It was President Putin. Okay? The guy who is responsible for the increased European defense spending is Vladimir Putin. The one who's responsible for the German Bundestag, the German parliament, just a month ago, taking a historic decision and committing to getting to 2%. Next year, they're going to go from 1.4 to 2%, which is about a 30 or 40 billion euro increase for German defense spending. And on top of that, Chancellor Scholz got from the Bundestag a 100 billion euro one-time supplemental fund, all to boost German defense spending. So, if you had asked me, as the guy who walked the NATO hallways for 4 years, urging my German counterpart to do more on this and lead the way so that Europe could have a sort of an autonomous defense capability, I would have said, nah, not likely. But Putin's pulled it off. And Germany is on track. Now, the more strategic question is, does that mean that Europe can focus on Europe and deter Russia and wait Putin out and figure out what follows him, as the previous question suggested, while the U.S. shifts its focus to Asia? The answer is yes. I think there is the possibility, again, thanks to Vladimir Putin, of an increased division of labor between Europe and the United States, with the United States increasingly focused on Asia. But look, Asia does not require all of American defense capability. We've built such a capable and expensive, I like that, defense capability that we can do more than one thing at a time, right? There are some capabilities in the European theater, nuclear weapons, for example, that we don't want them to aspire to, right? We don't want nuclear proliferation among NATO allies, because that opens a Pandora's box that we may not be too happy to. So I think there'll be some high-end capabilities that the U.S. will continue to contribute to Europe, but increasingly, especially the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Air Force, will shift its way towards the Indo-Pacific. And that's because of this competition with China. Now, a corollary question, right? Maybe the next question would be, so what does China take from the Ukraine-Putin experience, right? Well, I know what Taiwan's taking, right? If Taiwan is the next potential Ukraine case, right, where a big power tries to take over a smaller power, smaller country nearby, next door. Taiwan should be thinking about how Ukraine is fighting this war. And in my view, should pay less attention to high-end, expensive, very technologically difficult to buy and maintain systems, and more about how are you going to defend Taiwan? Empowered by modern technology, but more about who's doing the fighting, not, the big kid. What should President Xi of China be taking from this fight? First of all, I think he might have been a little surprised that, my Russian partners here are not all that they've said they are in terms of military power. He might be thinking, the Chinese military hasn't fought in a long time. They're telling me that they're pretty good. I've poured a lot of money into the PLA. I wonder if I've got a Russian army quality in the PLA. And then I think Xi has got to be looking at the economic consequences of what Putin means. China's two largest trading partners are the EU at $850 billion a year, and the US at $650 a year. Okay? And if you look at the center of the sanctions regime against Russia for invading a neighbor, that's, I'm using my math here, but 1.5 trillion a year, okay, of Chinese trade that has just been demonstrated will be at risk if China does something similar. So out of all the military stuff, I'm not sure how much attention Xi's paying to that. He's got to be paying attention to the economic consequences of this. And it may have, if there's a silver lining in this tragedy of Ukraine, it may be the deterrent effect on China. I told you I'm optimist. I declared my hand up front.
All right, we have a question from online from Georgiana. She would like to know, you spoke a little bit earlier about how about half of the world's population, or the governments that represent them, did not or are not part of the sanctions.
80%. 80% of the world's population is led by governments that are not in the sanctions.
Can you talk a little bit more about why that decision has been made by those countries? Obviously, every country has its own reasoning, but some generalities.
Well, some of them have interests with Russia. I mean, if you look at India, for example, sort of an iconic example of sitting on the fence with regard to sanctions regime, they have a long history of buying military hardware from Russia, and they're not They're not ready to break that tie overnight. India has a long national history of non-alignment, right? And staying out of these big superpower conflicts. So there are some cases like that. I think there are other cases, however, where they don't believe that what happens in Ukraine is going to reach them. But I think this summer, with the food crisis that Toria mentioned, and as we talked repeatedly this evening, the energy crisis, we're going to see that this reaches everybody. So it'll be interesting to see what happens to that 20% number. Does it grow over time as hunger sets in the Middle East and Africa, for example? It might.
But I just want to note that that coalition that was built is unprecedented. The only way you get close to that is when you pass sanctions through a Security Council resolution, which makes it binding on all nations. That was not an option because Russia's on the Security Council. They would block it. So the fact that we're even discussing such a level of financial control and sanctions is pretty extraordinary.
And it really demonstrates this point we made earlier, right? That this is a historic point. Sometimes when you're in history, you know, when you're experiencing history, it's just too close. Remember the days right after 9/11? I mean, nobody could, we were all a little traumatized, right? We were disoriented. And you didn't realize that that was going to flavor the next 20 years of American international involvement. But it did, right? I think we're in another scenario right now. It's just too close. And we can't quite imagine all the ripple effects. But they're going to hit us. And I mean, most significantly, the first big wave to hit the shore here is Finland and Sweden joining NATO. I mean, these are two neutral countries, right? In the case of Sweden, 200 years of neutrality in their history. So at least the Finns and the Swedes get it, right? They understand that this is different, and they've taken steps to protect themselves.
Tim, did you have another question?
We do, unless there's one in the room. No? Okay. So Sharon would like to talk a little bit more about NATO expansion, and more specifically previous expansion. A number of people have suggested that the offer to Ukraine for NATO expansion at some point is the cause of Russia's invasion. Can you give some insights as to where you land on that question?
Yeah, so I think that Putin's mentioning the potential of Ukrainian membership as a pretext for war is completely made up. It's completely BS, sorry. It's Kremlin propaganda. Why is that? Because, first of all, Vladimir Putin himself has signed any number of agreements and communiques and so forth, taking just the opposite path, which is that each nation has this fundamental national sovereign choice of alignment. And remember, in 2014, if we go back to the previous invasion of Ukraine, right? It wasn't anything to do with NATO. It had everything to do with just an accessions agreement with the EU that was agreed by the Ukrainian government, aligned with Putin, but then reversed by that same Ukrainian government. That's what brought the Ukrainian people out into the streets in the Maidan, right? So it didn't have to do with NATO. It had to do with, in that case, the EU. Here's what really threatens Putin. It is not NATO membership. He's already got, I mean, if you look at the old Warsaw Pact Treaty, which was, you know, the USSR's equivalent to NATO, there were 8 members of the Warsaw Pact. 7 of them are at the NATO table today, okay? If you look at the 15 SSRs, Soviet Socialist Republics, that made up the Union, the USSR, right? It had 15 subordinate countries or states. 3 of them are at the table at NATO today, the 3 Baltic states. All the remaining 12 SSRs have partnership agreements with NATO. Russia has a partnership agreement with NATO. Russia served alongside NATO troops in the Balkans, first in Bosnia and later in Kosovo. So this whole idea of, you know, NATO as a invading force or something, it doesn't bring it up. But here's what plays out, and this is the pretext for invasion that Putin didn't share with us. It is that a Ukraine that is increasingly democratic, and a Ukraine that is increasingly prosperous and affiliating, by way of that prosperity, fueled by association with the European Union, and integrating into the world marketplace. That Ukraine is a threat to Russia, not because it's going to invade Russia, but because it's the model that it presents to the Russian people. Why is Ukraine in particular such a threat to Russia? Because of the very close ethnic, Slavic, religious, cultural, linguistic ties between the Ukrainian people and the Russian people. Russia cannot tolerate a successful Ukraine as a neighbor. Why? Because the Russian people are going to say, if them, why not us? That's the existential threat to Vladimir Putin, and that's why he's losing his army in Ukraine today over that threat. So we should be very careful. I mean, the academics worldwide will debate this whole NATO enlargement thing. That's not the issue. The real truth is that when the wall came down, when the Soviet Union broke apart, and when these countries, which for decades had been under the iron fist of first Stalin and then the Soviet Union, his successors in the Soviet Union, and they had a chance to vote with their feet, they walked west. Okay? And they walked west because they had experienced the Iron Curtain. And they said, this is an opportunity. It's a lot like Sweden and Finland today. We have an opportunity. We're not going to miss this opportunity. And that's why these countries, former of the Warsaw Pact, and in the case of the Baltic states, former SSRs, are now sitting at the table with the American ambassador, my successor, at NATO. They had a choice. They made the choice, and they did what was right for them. And you know, for every voting citizen in those countries, they had lived the alternative. This wasn't a history lesson, right? They had lived it. I mean, this is Melissa's generation, right?
Well, I'm guessing we're coming close to the end. Let me ask you one last question here. You've been a diplomat and you've been a military leader, and you sort of jokingly said, you know, institutions like this one or Dartmouth or other places could really do some hard work at realigning how we talk about our interests, how we organize ourselves to have a strategy and support it. Tell us a little bit more about how we get that balance right. What would you say at a time when many of us in America feel more divided than we're comfortable feeling?
Well, it starts here. You know, it's got to start at home. I mean, first of all, if we're not coherent and effective, if our democracy doesn't deliver for us, we've got big problems abroad. First of all, if our democracy doesn't deliver for us, we're consumed by us. So we're insular, we tend to be introspective, we're self-absorbed, right? This is a lot like, look, if you've got personal problems, you're not out making new friends. You know, you're dealing with your own personal problems. Well, we're dealing with those as a country today, right? The second issue is that if our democracy doesn't deliver for Americans, the image that we present, the attractiveness of the rules-based order that we've created and our parents created after World War II, right, is less attractive to others. And this is where, you know, it's a bit self-defeating for us to declare that everybody ought to be, you know, a bright, shining democracy when we have so much work to do on democracy here at home. So the first place to start on all these, in fact, every World Affairs Council across America, there's probably 50 of them. Every state has one. Yeah, it's pretty close, right? Ought to start with this whole idea of how do we get healthy at home? And this doesn't have to do with just one administration. Don't get me wrong. This is not one guy, one administration. Some of these trends have been going on for a long time. And if you look at our Congress, for example, our Congress has not delivered for the American people the way that we as a citizen should expect well before the last administration. This is not one administration's worth of problems. So we've got a lot of work to do. You know, we're about to face, what can individual citizens do, right? We're about to face midterm elections here, midterm congressional elections, right? 2 years after that. I mean, this time next year, we're back into a presidential election cycle, right? So, I don't have to tell you from New Hampshire, right? I understand that you get this, right? But the point is, you know, protecting our voting is really critical. And it, in my view, is the first step for democracy working. So when I talk about democracy working, yes, I mean the Congress has got to deliver. And yes, I mean there's got to be some cross-aisle collaboration and so forth. But it starts with us, right? And, you know, some of you are probably election officials, local election officials and so forth, right? New Hampshire has a great reputation, a great sort of tradition in that regard. But there are things going on with regard to protecting the vote across America that goes right to the very heart of our democracy, and we have to pay attention to this. And again, it's not all one party or another, but there are some very dangerous trends here, and we have to wake up and pay attention to this. So that's why grassroots organizations like yours, right, and civic organizations and so forth, get out the vote, registration processes, and all that are so vitally important to our democracy, because that's where it starts. That's step one.
Well, you can tell when people have served in the U.S. government, they believe deeply in our values, and they do a great job overseas as well as here at home. So thank you so much. I think we're drawing this to a close. I can give the microphone back to you, Tim.
Well, thank you to both our wonderful speakers here tonight, Dr. Holt and Ambassador Lute. Join me in congratulating them on a very special. We really appreciate both of you giving us your time, your insights, and helping us to better understand some of these very complex issues that we face as a global community these days. I also wanted to give a big thanks to Alan, our Events and Education Coordinator, for the years work on we certainly have thrown him into the fire in figuring all of this out, and he does a great job for us, so thank you. And thank you to Denise for being our photographer as well. Staff at the World Affairs Council, and we're able to do this work because of the support we receive from people like you. We really appreciate everyone who comes to our events, who supports our organization, and who thinks globally while living locally. Thank you so much. For anyone who is a patron here tonight, the dinner afterwards is through this back door, so you can join us there at your leisure. And for everyone else, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it. I think it was a wonderful event, a great discussion, and we're excited to announce our fall programming in the next couple of months. So we'll see you in the fall. Thank you both.